In March 1947, a county health inspector in remote Pike County, Kentucky, knocked on the door of a cabin so isolated that no road reached it. What he discovered inside would force authorities to confront a horror that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade. Before we dive into the story, if you appreciate the meticulous research and respectful storytelling that goes into uncovering these buried truths, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop your location and the time where you are. It's amazing how far these videos travel. Now, let's continue with the story. The dirt path leading to the Vance property wound through dense hardwood forest for 3 miles beyond where the county road ended. State Health Inspector Harold Kemper had made dozens of home visits across eastern Kentucky's rugged terrain, but none required the physical endurance this one demanded. His boots sank into March mud as he climbed the steep hillside, following directions scribbled on a fragment of paper by the postmaster in Elkhorn City. Pike County's health department had launched a comprehensive survey of isolated households following a diphtheria outbreak the previous winter. Several families in the remote hollows had been overlooked during vaccination campaigns simply because authorities didn't know they existed. The Vance brothers' cabin appeared on a surveyor's map from 1938, but no official had visited since their father's death in 1939. Kemper reached a clearing just before noon. The cabin stood against the mountainside, its logs darkened by weather and time. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, indicating occupancy. The structure showed signs of neglect. Several roof shingles had blown away, and one window had been covered with canvas instead of glass. A lean-to shed housed what appeared to be minimal livestock, just 3 chickens scratching in the dirt. He knocked firmly on the rough-hewn door. Minutes passed before it opened partially. A man in his early 40s peered out, his face gaunt and weathered beyond his years. Kemper introduced himself and explained the purpose of his visit. The man, who identified himself as Earl Vance, seemed reluctant, but eventually stepped aside. The interior shocked even Kemper's experienced eye. The single room reeked of human waste and rot. Minimal furniture occupied the space. A wood stove provided heat, and a crude table held tin dishes encrusted with old food. But it was the far corner that made Kemper's breath catch. A woman sat on a filthy mattress, her wrist connected to an iron ring bolted into the log wall by a heavy chain. The restraint allowed perhaps 6 feet of movement. She wore a tattered dress stained beyond recognition. Her gray hair hung in matted clumps. When she looked up at Kemper, her eyes held something worse than fear. They held the emptiness of someone who had abandoned hope so long ago that its memory had faded. Earl Vance spoke, casually, as though the scene required no explanation. His mother, he said, had spells. The chain kept her from wandering off the mountain and getting lost. She was fed regularly and kept warm. His brother Clayton would return shortly from checking their snare lines. Kemper's hands trembled as he asked to examine the woman. Earl shrugged permission. As the inspector approached, he noticed the iron ring had worn a groove into the log wall from years of pressure. The shackle around Ida Vance's wrist had created permanent scarring. Her physical condition suggested malnutrition and prolonged immobility. She spoke only once during his initial examination, her voice barely a whisper. "How long has it been?" she asked. Kemper didn't understand the question until much later, when he realized she had lost track of time itself. Earl and Clayton Vance had been born 18 months apart, in 1904 and 1906. Sons of Samuel and Ida Vance. County birth records showed both deliveries occurred at home, typical for mountain families who lived beyond the reach of hospitals. Their childhood left little documentary trace, though neighbors remembered the family as reclusive, even by the standards of Pike County's isolated hollows. Samuel Vance had worked sporadically in the coal mines near Shelby Gap, but an injury in 1928 left him unable to perform underground labor. The family retreated further into self-sufficiency on their mountain property, venturing into town perhaps 3 or 4 times yearly for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. School attendance records for Earl and Clayton showed they stopped coming after 4th and 3rd grade respectively, though whether this resulted from distance, necessity, or parental choice remained unclear. The death of Samuel Vance in October 1939 marked a turning point that locals recalled with disturbing clarity. He had been 58, killed when a rotted tree fell on him while cutting firewood. Because the family had no telephone and lived so remotely, his body wasn't discovered for 5 days. Earl and Clayton had carried their father's corpse down the mountain themselves, arriving at the undertaker in Elkhorn City with a wagon pulled by their aging mule. The funeral drew a modest crowd of distant relatives and neighbors. Several attendees later told investigators they remembered Ida Vance's demeanor as strangely subdued, even for a grieving widow. She stood between her sons throughout the service, speaking to no one. When offered condolences, she merely nodded. One cousin recalled trying to invite Ida to stay with her family for a few weeks, but Earl had interrupted, insisting their mother preferred to remain on familiar ground during her mourning. That was the last time anyone from the community saw Ida Vance. In the months following Samuel's death, Earl and Clayton made their infrequent trips to town alone. When asked about their mother, they offered explanations that seemed reasonable at the time. She had taken their father's death hard. She preferred solitude. The mountain air suited her better than town crowds. Sometimes they mentioned she had developed a tremor in her hands that embarrassed her in public. The brothers themselves struck most people as simple but harmless. They sold ginseng root they harvested from the forest, occasionally brought in pelts from trapped animals, and purchased basic supplies with the modest income these provided. Store clerks remembered them as quiet men who counted their money carefully and never caused trouble. They smelled of wood smoke and isolation, but so did many mountain families. What no one questioned was why 2 unmarried men in their 30s continued living together on a remote homestead with no apparent prospects. In Appalachian communities where economic options were limited and family ties ran deep, such arrangements drew no particular attention. Sons caring for an aging mother seemed natural, even admirable. The brothers maintained this facade with remarkable consistency. They never invited anyone to visit. They never mentioned problems at home. They never displayed the kind of erratic behavior that might have raised concerns. Their isolation, which had seemed merely a family preference during their father's lifetime, became their greatest advantage. By 1947, 8 years had passed since Samuel Vance's funeral. The community had long since stopped asking about Ida. Most assumed she had simply passed away quietly on the mountain, and the brothers, in their awkward way, had never gotten around to reporting it. Death without official documentation wasn't uncommon in remote areas, where the living focused on survival rather than bureaucracy. Harold Kemper left the cabin that March afternoon with a promise to return with proper medical supplies. He didn't keep that promise. Instead, he rode directly to the Pike County Sheriff's Office in Pikeville, arriving just before the courthouse closed for the day. Sheriff Raymond Tackett listened to Kemper's account with increasing alarm, then immediately organized a team to return to the mountain before nightfall. By the time they reached the Vance property with 2 deputies and the county physician, darkness had settled over the hollow. The brothers seemed unsurprised by the visit. Earl lit kerosene lamps while Clayton stood near the door with his arms crossed, silent and watchful. Dr. Martin Claypool approached Ida Vance with his medical bag, speaking softly as he examined her by lamplight. The shackle around her wrist had been there so long that scar tissue had formed around the metal. Claypool later documented that the restraint showed no evidence of regular removal for cleaning or inspection. Her muscles had atrophied from prolonged immobility. Bed sores covered her lower back and hips. Her teeth were in severe decay. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds, skeletal for a woman who had once stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. When Claypool asked Ida directly how long she had been chained, she looked confused. Time had become meaningless in the unchanging routine of captivity. Earl answered for her, claiming it had been maybe 2 years since her spells worsened. The sheriff's eyes moved to the deep groove worn into the log wall by the chain's iron ring. 2 years could not have created such damage. Tackett ordered the brothers to produce a key. Earl retrieved it from a nail above the doorframe. The shackle Ezekiel opened with difficulty. Its mechanism corroded. As it fell away, Ida rubbed her wrist unconsciously, a gesture that suggested years of habit. She seemed uncertain what to do with her freedom, remaining seated on the mattress. The interrogation began carefully. Sheriff Tackett had dealt with difficult family situations before, but this acquired delicacy. He asked when exactly the restraint had begun. Clayton finally spoke, his voice flat and defensive. Their mother had tried to walk off the mountain in winter, he claimed. They had found her hypothermic and confused. The chain prevented her from harming herself during future episodes. But Dr. Claypool's examination contradicted this narrative. Ida showed no signs of frostbite scarring or cold-related injuries. Her physical deterioration suggested years, not months, of immobility. When pressed, she whispered that her husband had been dead a long time. How long, she couldn't say, but she remembered the leaves had been falling when they buried him. October 1939. The chronology began crystallizing in Tackett's mind. He asked Ida if the chain had been placed after her husband's funeral. She nodded slowly. Earl's face hardened. He insisted they had acted out of necessity, that their mother's mental state required such measures for her own protection. Yet Ida showed no signs of the violent dementia or psychosis that might justify such extreme restraint. She was compliant, responsive, and oriented to her surroundings, despite her confusion about time. The deputies found additional evidence as they searched the cabin. A second shackle and chain hung from a beam near the sleeping area the brothers shared. The purpose of this restraint became clear when Dr. Claypool discovered bruising and scarring on Ida's ankles that matched the dimensions of the device. She had been moved between restraint points, suggesting a deliberate system rather than emergency intervention. Sheriff Tackett placed both brothers under arrest as the sun rose over the mountain. Ida Vance was carried down the treacherous path on a makeshift stretcher, leaving the cabin for the first time in 8 years. The full scope of what had occurred in that isolated cabin emerged slowly through medical examinations and careful interviews conducted over the following weeks. Dr. Claypool's written reports, preserved in Pike County court records, detailed injuries that painted a picture far more disturbing than simple imprisonment. Ida had suffered repeated physical trauma consistent with sexual assault over an extended period. Internal scarring suggested sustained abuse rather than isolated incidents. The physician noted evidence of healed fractures in her ribs and left wrist that had never received proper medical treatment. These injuries appeared defensive in nature, indicating she had resisted at some point before her spirit broke completely. The brothers had established a routine of depravity that went beyond what could be justified by any claim of mental illness management. Ida's testimony, given in fragments to a female social worker named Dorothy Henshaw, revealed that the abuse began within weeks of her husband's burial. Earl had been the instigator, but Clayton had participated willingly. They had justified their actions with twisted logic, claiming their mother owed them for the care they provided. The restraint system served a dual purpose. It prevented escape, certainly, but it also maintained constant accessibility. The second shackle near the brothers' sleeping area allowed them to move her at will. She had been treated not as a human being requiring care, but as property to be used according to their desires. The chains ensured she could never refuse, never flee, never seek help from the outside world. What made the testimony even more harrowing was Ida's description of the psychological techniques employed alongside physical restraint. The brothers had convinced her that reporting them would result in their execution, leaving her to starve alone on the mountain. They told her repeatedly that no one in town asked about her anymore, that she had been forgotten. They described in detail how treacherous the path down the mountain was, how she would fall and die if she attempted escape. Over time, these lies became her reality. She had tried to resist during the first year. The healed fractures testified to that. But the brothers had responded to defiance with calculated cruelty. They withheld food for days. They left her in darkness without a lamp. They described in graphic terms what would happen if she continued fighting. Eventually, Ida had learned that submission brought marginally better treatment. Resistance brought suffering that made the baseline horror seem merciful by comparison. The abuse followed patterns. Earl was violent and unpredictable, his assaults accompanied by rage that seemed to stem from some deep resentment. Clayton was methodical and cold, treating the acts as routine maintenance rather than crimes. Both men had become so desensitized to their mother's humanity that they showed no shame when initially confronted. They seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' horror. Court documents revealed additional details that witnesses found almost impossible to absorb. The brothers had forced Ida to participate in acts that defied description in the formal language of 1947 legal proceedings. Prosecutors struggled to find terminology that conveyed the severity without being overly explicit for a public trial. The judge eventually ordered portions of the testimony sealed, deemed too disturbing for general consumption. Perhaps most chilling was the realization that the brothers had maintained outward normalcy throughout. They had walked into town, purchased supplies, engaged in basic commerce, then returned to their cabin and continued the systematic brutalization of their mother. The compartmentalization required for such behavior suggested a level of depravity that went beyond temporary moral failure into something fundamentally broken. The Vance property sat at an elevation of 2,800 feet, accessible only by the treacherous footpath that had challenged Harold Kemper during his initial visit. Pike County's topography had served as the brothers' silent accomplice, creating natural barriers that proved as effective as any prison wall. The nearest occupied dwelling belonged to the Spurlock family, whose small farm lay 2.5 miles northeast through dense forest. Between the properties, the terrain rose and fell dramatically, cut by seasonal streams that became impassable torrents during spring rains. Even experienced hunters avoided the area during winter months, when snow and ice made the ridges lethal. Sheriff Tackett's investigation revealed that this isolation was no accident. Samuel Vance had deliberately chosen the remote location in 1922, purchasing 80 acres of mountain land that most considered worthless for farming or logging. His sons had inherited not just property, but a philosophy of separation from society. The distance that had seemed merely eccentric during their father's lifetime became a weapon in their hands. The cabin itself occupied a natural shelf on the mountainside, backed by a limestone cliff that blocked approach from above. The only practical route in or out followed the winding path through the hollow. Anyone attempting to leave would be visible for long stretches, making escape impossible without significant head start. The brothers had chosen their sleeping positions strategically, with one always positioned near the door. County records showed no telephone lines within 5 miles of the property. The nearest road suitable for automobile traffic ended at Shelby Gap, requiring an additional hour's walk beyond that point. Even if Ida had somehow freed herself and fled, reaching help would have demanded physical stamina she no longer possessed after years of immobility. Weather patterns added another layer of isolation. The hollow received minimal sunlight during winter months, and fog frequently settled in the low areas, obscuring visibility. Spring brought mud that made the path nearly impassable. Summer's heat created conditions where exertion could lead to heat exhaustion. Only autumn offered relatively favorable conditions, but by then, Ida's captivity was already entrenched. The brothers had exploited every advantage their geography provided. They knew the mountain intimately, having spent their entire lives learning its rhythms and dangers. They understood which neighbors might pass nearby during hunting season and adjusted their outdoor activities accordingly. They had established patterns of behavior that gave them warning if anyone approached, their chickens providing an early alert system when disturbed by unfamiliar footsteps. Most significantly, the isolation had created a psychological barrier as formidable as any physical one. Ida had internalized the impossibility of escape. Even when unchained by Sheriff Tackett, she had remained seated, unable to imagine freedom as a genuine option. The mountain had become her universe, and her sons the absolute authorities within it. Local topographic surveys conducted after the arrests revealed something else troubling. 3 other inhabited cabins existed within a 5-mile radius, all occupied by families living in similar isolation. Authorities had no systematic way to check on these households. The Vance case had succeeded not because the brothers were particularly clever, but because the system contained no mechanism to detect such crimes when they occurred beyond the reach of regular social contact. The mountain had kept its secret for 8 years. Without Harold Kemper's chance assignment to survey remote households for vaccination purposes, it might have kept that secret indefinitely. As news of the arrests spread through Pike County, a disturbing pattern emerged during the investigation. Multiple people had noticed Ida Vance's absence over the years, yet none had pursued the matter with any urgency. The reasons for this collective inaction revealed uncomfortable truths about community dynamics in isolated mountain regions. Testimony from the brothers' trial exposed numerous missed opportunities. Thomas Ramey, who operated the general store in Elkhorn City, recalled asking about Ida in 1941. Earl had told him she suffered from severe arthritis and rarely left her bed. Ramey had accepted this explanation without question, later admitting he hadn't wanted to pry into family business. Mountain culture valued privacy above almost everything else. A cousin named Ruth Bingham testified that she had suggested visiting Ida in 1943 to bring her preserves and company. Clayton had politely declined, explaining that their mother's condition had worsened and visitors upset her. Bingham had felt rebuffed and never offered again. She wept on the witness stand, saying she should have insisted, but such persistence would have been considered rude and intrusive. The postmaster in Elkhorn City, Gerald Sykes, remembered conversations where locals speculated about Ida's fate. The general consensus had been that she probably died shortly after Samuel and the brothers simply hadn't reported it. Some thought this was laziness, Others assumed the brothers wanted to continue collecting her small widow's pension. Nobody considered that she might be alive and suffering. This assumption had been so widespread that when Harold Kemper mentioned planning to visit the Vance cabin, Sykes had told him not to expect finding anyone there besides the brothers. The idea that Ida might still be living after 8 years of absence from town seemed implausible to everyone who knew the family. Church records provided another troubling detail. Reverend Paul Hutchins of the Elkhorn Baptist Church had conducted Samuel Vance's funeral service. He testified that he had intended to make pastoral visits to check on the widow, as was his custom. However, the distance and difficulty of reaching the cabin had caused him to postpone the visit repeatedly. Eventually, he assumed the brothers had the situation under control. He admitted feeling shame that ministerial duties had been sacrificed to convenience. Several hunters who had passed near the Vance property over the years reported seeing smoke from the chimney and occasionally spotting one or both brothers outside. None had stopped to visit. Mountain etiquette dictated you didn't approach someone's home uninvited, particularly when the residents had a reputation for preferring solitude. The brothers had never been hostile, but they had never been welcoming either. One witness provided especially damning testimony. Jacob Spurlock, whose family lived nearest to the Vance cabin, admitted he had heard what sounded like a woman crying one evening in 1944. He had mentioned it to his wife, who suggested it might have been a wildcat or screech owl. They had convinced themselves of this explanation because the alternative, that someone was in distress, would have required action they were reluctant to take in the dark over dangerous terrain. The pattern was unmistakable. Appalachian culture's emphasis on self-reliance and non-interference in family matters had created an environment where abuse could flourish undetected. People had noticed anomalies, but had chosen the comfort of plausible explanations over the discomfort of investigation. The brothers hadn't needed to threaten their neighbors into silence. Social norms had done that work for them. The Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Earl Vance and Clayton Vance commenced in Pike County Circuit Court on September 15, 1947. Judge Marcus Holbrook presided over proceedings that would test the limits of existing law and community tolerance for confronting the unthinkable. Prosecutor James Caldwell faced immediate challenges in framing the charges. Kentucky statute in 1947 contained no specific provisions for the sustained sexual abuse of a family member by adult children. The crimes had to be prosecuted under existing frameworks for assault, kidnapping, and what the law termed outrages against public decency. Each charge carried maximum sentences that seemed inadequate for 8 years of systematic brutality. The defense attorneys, appointed by the court after the brothers claimed poverty, pursued a strategy of diminished capacity. Leonard Pritchard argued that Earl and Clayton had been so isolated from normal society that they lacked understanding of moral and legal boundaries. He presented their limited education, their father's reclusive influence, and their lifelong separation from community standards as mitigating factors. This argument required a delicate balance. The defense needed the brothers to appear impaired enough to warrant leniency, but competent enough to stand trial. Pritchard called a psychiatrist from Lexington who testified that prolonged isolation could indeed warp normal social development. However, under cross-examination, the psychiatrist admitted that isolation didn't erase the fundamental human capacity to recognize suffering in others. The prosecution's case relied heavily on medical evidence and Ida's testimony. Dr. Claypool presented his findings with clinical precision, describing injuries in terms that left no doubt about their origin. The jury, composed entirely of men as was standard practice, sat in visible discomfort as the physician detailed scarring patterns and healed fractures. Ida herself took the stand on the fourth day of trial. Dorothy Henshaw accompanied her, providing support as she answered questions in a voice barely audible beyond the first row of spectators. Defense attorney Pritchard attempted to suggest her memory might be unreliable after years of alleged trauma, but her testimony proved remarkably consistent. She remembered specific incidents, seasonal details, and the progression of abuse with clarity that undermined claims of mental incompetence. The defense called character witnesses who described the brothers as simple mountain men who had never caused trouble in town. Store clerks testified they had always been polite customers. A coal mine foreman who had known their father spoke about Samuel's strict nature and isolation from other workers. These testimonies aimed to paint a picture of men shaped by circumstances beyond their control rather than inherently evil. Prosecutor Caldwell dismantled this narrative methodically. He presented the grooved log wall as evidence of premeditation and sustained intent. He highlighted the purchase records, showing the brothers had bought chains and shackles from a hardware store in Pikeville, proving they had planned the restraint system rather than improvising during a crisis. He noted their ability to function normally in social situations when necessary, demonstrating they understood societal expectations even if they chose to violate them in private. The most powerful moment came when Caldwell produced Ida's wedding ring, found discarded in a corner of the cabin. He asked her to identify it, then asked the jury to consider what kind of men would chain their own mother while surrounded by symbols of the family life she had once known. The courtroom remained silent as Ida turned the ring over in her scarred hands, unable to fit it over swollen knuckles. The medical and psychological analysis of both victim and perpetrators revealed dimensions of the case that challenged contemporary understanding of human behavior and trauma. Dr. Claypool's comprehensive report, submitted as evidence, documented physical consequences that would affect Ida for whatever remained of her life. Beyond the visible scarring and healed fractures, Ida suffered from severe malnutrition that had caused permanent damage to her organs. Her kidneys showed signs of chronic infection, likely from unsanitary conditions and inadequate hygiene facilities. Dental decay had progressed to the point where several teeth required extraction, and infections in her gums had spread into her jawbone. Her vision had deteriorated significantly, possibly from years in dim lighting and lack of proper nutrition. The prolonged immobility had created complications that Dr. Claypool documented with clinical concern. Muscle atrophy in her legs meant she could barely stand without assistance. Her spine had developed abnormal curvature from spending years in limited positions. Circulation problems in her extremities suggested she would likely face chronic pain and limited mobility, even with extensive rehabilitation. At 62, her body showed the deterioration of someone decades older. Yet the physical damage, however severe, paled beside the psychological impact. Dr. William Ferris, a psychiatrist brought from the University of Kentucky, conducted extensive interviews with Ida over several weeks. His findings, presented during the trial, described a woman who had developed profound learned helplessness. She struggled to make basic decisions about her own care, constantly seeking permission before acting. When offered food, she would wait to be told she could eat it. When taken outdoors, she would stand motionless until instructed where to go. Dr. Ferris testified that Ida displayed symptoms consistent with what military psychiatrists were beginning to identify in prisoners of war. She experienced nightmares, sudden panic attacks triggered by seemingly innocuous stimuli, and periods of dissociation where she seemed to retreat entirely from external reality. The sound of chains or the sight of rope caused visible distress. She flinched at sudden movements, particularly from men. Most troubling was her relationship with time and memory. Ida could recall events from before her captivity with reasonable clarity. She remembered her wedding, the births of her sons, daily life with Samuel. But the 8 years of imprisonment had blurred into an undifferentiated mass of suffering. She couldn't always separate one year from another, one assault from the next. Her mind had apparently protected itself by refusing to catalog each individual horror. The psychological examination of Earl and Clayton proved equally disturbing, though in different ways. Dr. Ferris noted that neither brother displayed conventional remorse. They seemed genuinely confused by the severity of society's reaction to their behavior. Earl, when questioned, insisted they had provided for their mother's basic needs. Clayton maintained they had prevented her from coming to harm on the dangerous mountain terrain. Both men showed profound deficits in empathy and moral reasoning. When Dr. Ferris described hypothetical scenarios of suffering, they could intellectually identify the emotions involved, but seemed unable to connect those emotions to their mother's experience. It was as though they had developed a complete psychological separation between Ida as their mother and Ida as the person they had victimized. The psychiatrist theorized that their father's influence had been more damaging than initially understood. Samuel Vance, by all accounts, had been a harsh disciplinarian who viewed women as fundamentally subordinate. He had isolated his family, not just physically but ideologically, creating a worldview where normal social rules didn't apply. After his death, the brothers had apparently escalated behaviors that might have been constrained by his presence, however brutal he had been. Dr. Ferris noted something else significant. The brothers displayed no sexual interest in anyone outside their immediate family situation. They had never sought relationships with women in town, never visited prostitutes, never showed signs of normal adult sexuality. Their depravity seemed entirely focused on the one person rendered completely powerless in their isolated world. The prosecution used this analysis to argue against the defense's diminished capacity claims. Yes, the brothers had been shaped by isolation and poor parenting. But they had demonstrated the ability to understand social norms when it suited them. They had maintained a facade of normalcy during their trips to town. They had concealed their crimes deliberately. They had understood that what they were doing would be condemned if discovered, which was why they had gone to such lengths to prevent discovery. The defense countered that this very compartmentalization proved psychological damage. Normal men didn't require such elaborate deception for behavior they believed was acceptable. The brothers' ability to function in public while committing atrocities in private suggested not cunning, but a fundamental fracture in their understanding of reality and morality. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before returning to the courtroom on September 23, 1947. The foreman, a hardware store owner from Pikeville named Chester Wolford, stood with visible strain as Judge Holbrook asked for the verdict. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. The courtroom, packed beyond capacity, remained eerily silent. Sentencing presented Judge Holbrook with a dilemma that kept him awake for 3 nights, according to his personal correspondence, discovered years later. Kentucky law provided maximum sentences for the individual charges, but no framework existed for addressing the cumulative horror of 8 years of sustained abuse. The judge could impose consecutive sentences, but even that seemed inadequate for crimes that had stolen nearly a decade of a woman's life. He scheduled the sentencing hearing for October 7th, allowing time for victim impact statements and final arguments. Dorothy Henshaw read a prepared statement on Ida's behalf, as Ida herself remained too fragile to appear. The statement described nights spent listening to sounds that reminded her of the cabin, days where she couldn't bring herself to eat because submission had required waiting for permission. It detailed the theft not just of her freedom, but of her sense of self, her trust in humanity, her ability to exist without fear. Defense attorney Pritchard made a final plea for leniency based on the brothers' backgrounds. He argued that sentencing them to die in prison would serve no rehabilitative purpose, that they were products of a broken system that had failed to integrate isolated families into broader society. He suggested psychiatric treatment rather than pure punishment, citing Dr. Ferris's testimony about their psychological damage. Prosecutor Caldwell responded with barely contained fury. He reminded the court that Ida Vance would never fully recover, that her remaining years would be shadowed by trauma that no amount of care could erase. He argued that the brothers had made deliberate choices, day after day, year after year, to continue their crimes. They had possessed numerous opportunities to stop, to seek help, to recognize their mother's humanity. They had chosen otherwise at every turn. Judge Holbrook delivered his ruling in a voice that witnesses described as heavy with exhaustion. He sentenced Earl Vance to 40 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary for kidnapping, assault, and moral turpitude. He sentenced Clayton Vance to 35 years on similar charges, with 5 years difference reflecting Earl's apparent role as primary instigator. Both sentences were to be served without possibility of parole for at least 20 years. The judge acknowledged the sentences felt insufficient. He stated plainly that if Kentucky law had provided appropriate charges for the specific nature of familial sexual abuse, the sentences would have been harsher. He expressed hope that the legislature would address this gap, though he held little optimism given the difficulty of discussing such matters in public forums. Before adjourning, Judge Holbrook made an unusual statement for the record. He criticized the community's failure to investigate Ida's disappearance, noting that legal punishment for the brothers would not address the broader social failure that had enabled their crimes. He called for Pike County to establish regular welfare checks for isolated households, particularly where elderly or vulnerable people might be at risk. The brothers showed no emotion as deputies prepared to transport them to Eddyville, where the state penitentiary was located. Earl stared straight ahead, his face blank. Clayton glanced once toward the area where Ida had sat during earlier proceedings, though she was absent during sentencing. Whatever thoughts crossed his mind remained unspoken. Outside the courthouse, newspaper reporters from Lexington and Louisville gathered reactions. Many townspeople expressed satisfaction with the verdict, but discomfort with the attention the case had brought to Pike County. Several people interviewed expressed the sentiment that such things should remain private family matters, even as they acknowledged the severity of the crimes. The cognitive dissonance reflected deeper tensions in Appalachian culture between traditional values of privacy and the need for outside intervention in cases of abuse. One editorial in the Lexington Herald-Leader, published 2 days after sentencing, captured the complicated legacy of the trial. The writer praised the justice system for holding the brothers accountable, while questioning how many other Ida Vances might exist in isolated hollows throughout eastern Kentucky, their suffering hidden by geography and cultural reluctance to interfere. The question hung unanswered, troubling but necessary. Ida Vance spent her remaining years at the Pike County Home for the Aged, a modest facility in Pikeville that had opened just 2 years before her arrival. The staff, unprepared for someone with her level of trauma, did their best to provide comfort and routine. She occupied a small room on the ground floor with a window overlooking a garden, though she rarely looked outside during her first months there. Dorothy Henshaw visited weekly, maintaining the relationship that had begun during the initial interviews. Through these visits, a picture emerged of Ida's gradual adjustment to freedom, though adjustment proved an inadequate word for the process. She learned to make simple choices again: what dress to wear, whether she wanted tea or coffee, when to go to bed. Each decision represented a small victory over years of having every aspect of her existence controlled. Physical rehabilitation proved limited by her age and the extent of damage. She never regained full mobility in her legs. Walking required a cane and assistance, and she tired quickly. Staff noted she seemed most comfortable in her room, where the limited space paradoxically provided security rather than confinement. Large open areas made her anxious, as though the absence of walls represented danger rather than freedom. The nightmares persisted. Other residents occasionally heard her crying out in the dark. Staff would find her sitting upright in bed, disoriented and frightened, convinced she was back in the cabin. These episodes decreased in frequency, but never fully disappeared. Dr. Ferris visited periodically to assess her mental state, documenting the slow, incomplete healing that was the best medicine could offer. Ida spoke rarely about her captivity after the trial concluded. When she did, it was in fragments, disconnected observations rather than coherent narratives. She mentioned once that she had counted the logs in the cabin wall thousands of times, memorizing every knot and groove. Another time, she described how she had measured time by the changing angle of sunlight through the single window, the only clock available to her. These small details, offered without context, suggested memories she carried, but couldn't fully articulate. She received few visitors beyond Dorothy Henshaw and occasional church members who felt obligated to demonstrate Christian charity. The cousin who had offered to take her in after Samuel's funeral came once, weeping and apologizing. Ida had comforted her, seemingly more concerned with the cousin's distress than her own suffering. This pattern repeated with other visitors. Ida absorbed guilt and pain from others while expressing little anger about her own experience. The brothers' time in prison followed different trajectories. Earl proved a difficult inmate, accumulating violations for fighting and refusing work assignments. Records from Eddyville showed multiple stretches in solitary confinement. He apparently maintained the same volatile temperament that had characterized his crimes, now directed at fellow prisoners and guards. In 1954, he was involved in a prison riot that left 2 inmates dead. His culpability remained unclear in official reports, but the incident added years to his sentence. Clayton adapted more successfully to institutional life. He worked in the prison laundry and caused no disciplinary problems. A chaplain's report from 1952 noted that Clayton attended religious services regularly, though he never spoke during group discussions. The chaplain observed that Clayton seemed to view prison as simply another form of isolation, neither better nor worse than the mountain cabin. He accepted his circumstances with the same flat effect he had displayed throughout the trial. Neither brother expressed remorse in any documented correspondence or conversation. They maintained limited contact with each other, despite being housed in the same facility. When asked about their crimes during parole hearings that began in the late 1960s, both provided the same explanations they had offered during the trial. They had been caring for their mother. They had used necessary measures. The world outside the mountain didn't understand their situation. Ida Vance died on January 12, 1956, at the age of 71. The death certificate listed heart failure, though staff at the county home believed she had simply reached the limit of what her damaged body could endure. She was buried in the Elkhorn City Cemetery, far from the mountain where she had suffered. Dorothy Henshaw arranged. The modest service, attended by perhaps 20 people, most of them strangers, fulfilling social obligation rather than mourning someone they had known. The Vance cabin was eventually torn down by the county in 1958, after vandals and curiosity seekers had picked it apart. The iron rings that had held the chains were removed and preserved as evidence, though they remained in storage rather than being displayed. The property itself reverted to the state for unpaid taxes. It sits abandoned to this day, gradually being reclaimed by the forest that once concealed its secrets. The case's legacy proved more complicated than Judge Holbrook had hoped. Kentucky did eventually pass legislation addressing elder abuse and creating mandatory reporting requirements for suspected cases. However, the law came with limited enforcement mechanisms, particularly in rural areas where isolation remained a fact of geography and culture. Welfare checks in remote regions continued to be sporadic at best. Earl Vance died in prison in 1973 at the age of 69, having never been released. Clayton survived until 1987, serving 40 years before dying of complications from emphysema. He was 81. Neither man ever admitted wrongdoing beyond acknowledging the facts that were already documented. Whatever capacity for remorse or self-reflection they might have possessed remained inaccessible to the end. The story periodically resurfaced in regional newspapers when journalists discovered the old court records, or when cases with similar patterns emerged elsewhere in Appalachia. Each retelling sparked brief conversations about isolation, family privacy, and the responsibility of communities to intervene when something seems wrong. These conversations rarely led to systemic changes. What remains most haunting about the Vance case is not just the brutality it exposed, but the ease with which it occurred. No elaborate conspiracy was required, no sophisticated deception. The brothers simply lived far enough from scrutiny that their crimes could continue year after year, protected by geography and cultural norms that valued non-interference above welfare. Ida Vance vanished in plain sight, her absence noticed but not investigated, her suffering unimaginable to those who might have helped. The case stands as a dark reminder that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they live on isolated mountains, maintaining ordinary interactions with the world while committing acts that defy comprehension. And sometimes the barriers protecting them aren't walls or weapons, but simply distance and the human tendency to accept convenient explanations rather than confront difficult truths. If this story has moved you to think differently about the vulnerable people in isolated communities, or if you believe these historical truths deserve to be remembered and learned from, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. These stories matter not because they're sensational, but because they remind us that vigilance and compassion are never optional. Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. And remember that behind every historical case are real people who suffered and deserve to be honored with truth.